Well, when I was 26, I joined the Peace Corps. And I was sent to Senegal, West Africa, because, you're going to make me nervous now, man. So I got sent to Senegal, West Africa, because I had studied a little bit of French at school. And French is the national language, the official language, I guess, of Senegal, but the Senegalese speak almost 40 other languages. And I had to learn 2 of them. One of them was Wolof, and one of them was Jola. Now, in particular, I had to learn Jola because I was going to be sent to a Jola village. I was going to be living with a Jola family, and this was going to be the language of my soon-to-be adopted people. Now, I'm pretty good at learning languages. I have a really good memory, although not so much now. But when I was younger, I had a really good memory. I could memorize vocabulary, and I knew verb conjugations. But when it comes to speaking another language with real native speakers of that language in real-life situations, all of that stuff that was in my head just goes out of my head. I don't know why. So I was a little nervous about learning Jola because I was already an outsider. And there's nothing that makes you feel more isolated when you're living in a community and you don't speak the language. It's just very isolating. So it was kind of worrying for me. But I was learning Jola, and so, maybe I could do it, maybe I couldn't. And about a month before us volunteers were sent out into our villages, the Peace Corps made us spend a week with a veteran volunteer who had already been in the country. I spent my week with a guy called Scott. He had been in Senegal for almost 3 years, totally fluent in like 3 or 4 different languages there. And he was showing me around the Casamance region of Senegal, which is where I was going to be stationed, sort of near him. And he introduced me to a man called Jean. And Jean, like a lot of Senegalese, lived in an extended family in a very close-knit community where elders reign supreme. And John was showing us his family's mango orchard and their rice paddies, because I was going to be an agricultural volunteer, so this was important to me. And then he wanted to introduce us to his family. So we go inside his house, and the Jola people, at least in this part of the Jola land, they live in these cinder block homes. And they're very large cinder block homes, and they're in the forest. And so we go into the back door, and it was very dark in there because there's no electricity. The only light is ambient, and it comes from window openings. There's no glass, there's just openings and then door openings. So I was waiting for my eyes to adjust to the room, and I could smell the thick smell of smoke. They cook on an open flame, and there was a little fire going kind of in the corner and a hearth, and the walls were stained with smoke. And I could smell the earth because there was an earthen floor, and we had kicked up some of the dust when we came in, so I was sort of grooving on the shimmering dust particles, in the lights in the shaft of light that was coming in through the window. And Scott and Jean were kind of over here, and they were speaking quietly between themselves in Jola. I didn't understand what they were saying, but they were speaking quietly. And then I see this woman come in to the kitchen from another door from an adjacent room. Her name was Inye, and she was Jean's mother. And she's clutching this chicken by the legs. It's dangling upside down. She's just kind of, holding this chicken. It was very much alive. It was quite still, which it probably knew its impending fate, which was going to be dinner that night. And, its little beady eyes were kind of looking around the room at us. And she sees me, and she looks over at Jean and Scott, and she's kind of scowling a little bit, and she walks over to those guys, and she starts speaking to her son, and they're speaking in Jola, of course, and Scott kind of comes over to me, and she's sort of shooting me these glances like this, and it was obviously she was upset about something, and I'm like, Scott, and he's going, So she starts yelling at John, and then I said, Scott, what's going on? And he said, well, Jean is asked, and John's being very calm, Mom yells, that's fine. John's just speaking very quietly. And Scott says to me, John is asking Inye to show you the vault. And he points to this huge wooden box that was suspended from the ceiling. It was probably like an 8 or 9 foot ceiling. It seemed very high to me at the time, as memory recalls. And there was this rickety sort of slapped together ladder that was leading up to this little hobbit door in the box. And Scott says, this is where the family keeps their rice. And Inye doesn't want you to see it. And I'm like, well, I kind of gathered that by the way she's like doing this and pointing in my direction and yelling at our son. And he says, she doesn't think you're Jola. And I said, I'm not Jola. And he goes, well, you're gonna be soon. And as soon as he said that, Jean and Inye stopped yelling and Jean stopped talking, and they both look at me, and Scott starts elbowing me in the ribs, and he says, use your Jola name when she asks you. Now, the Peace Corps had assigned us, given us Jola names, or names in whatever language we were going to be speaking. For me, it was Jola, to make us fit in better. So Inye looks at me, and she says, Kasumai. And it means peace, and this is the start of the Jola greetings. And when someone says Kasumai to you, it's really a question, and it means, do you have peace? And I said Kasumai Keb, which means peace only, even though I was feeling anything but peaceful right at that moment. But you gotta do the greetings. And she looks at Jean, and she looks at Scott, and she looks back at me, and she says, Karesibu, what's your first name? And I said, Saleh. She looks at Jean and looks at Scott and looks back at me and she goes, Kasafibu. What's your last name? And I said, Mane, Saleh Mane. That was my given Jola name. And then she looks at those guys again and she tosses that chicken down on the ground. And you never did see a chicken run faster. Colonel Sanders could have been chasing that thing and it couldn't have run any faster. And it's flapping out the door and making its escape. And then she looks at me and she crosses her arms and she goes, Ow, bye. Where are you from? And I hesitated because I didn't know if I should tell her I was from America or give her the name of my village that I was going to be assigned to. But I couldn't remember the name of my village. And I could see the look in her eyes. She's like, I got you now. And then suddenly I remembered it and I'm practically screaming it at her, Dana, Salimane, Dana. And she looks and she puts her hands on her hips and now she's almost smiling and she says, Kadasindawai, how are your people? And I said, Kokabo, they are there, they are fine. And then this smile starts to creep across her face. And it erupts into this laughter, and she's jumping up and down, and she's waving her arms, and she's shaking Jean, and she's waving her arms and everything. And the three of them start laughing, and they're chattering away in Jola, and I'm not understanding a word they're saying, but I guess it's all good because, she's not pointing a finger and shouting anymore. And so then Inye comes over to me and she grabs my arm and she starts tugging me over to this ladder. And I'm looking at Scott and he's going like this and I'm going, but ladder? And he's going, you gotta go up. And I said, but I hate ladders. And he said, you gotta go up. And so I'm like, okay. And Inye's pushing me up and Jean comes over and he hands her a lantern. And I start climbing this rickety ladder, and she's like right behind me on this ladder at the same time I'm on this ladder, and I'm praying to God this thing isn't gonna break in half and we come tumbling to the floor. So we get to the top, and Scott says, just push that door open when you get to the top. So I push the door open, and I crawl in, and it's this, pitch black in there because it's just this giant box. And there's not enough room for us to stand up all the way. We're kind of standing hunched, but Inye comes in after me and she motions for me to sit down on the floor. So we're both sitting cross-legged across from each other on the floor, and I could see by the light, by the glow of this lantern, we're surrounded by these burlap sacks that are just heaving with rice. And she picks up a few grains off the floor and she puts them into her hand, and this whole time she's speaking to me in Jola. And she picks up one grain and she does this, and I yell down the ladder. I said, Scott, you gotta help me. I have to understand. And he said, first they separate the big part of the chaff from the rice. And he can't see us, but he can hear what she's saying, and he knows Jola, so he's interpreting for me. And then she does this, and he says, and then they pound the rice. And then she clutches her hands and she's, motioning with a make-believe object, and he says, and then they sift out the chaff again. And then she's doing this, and he says, and then they grind it again with a wooden pestle. And then she opens her palm, and I can see the few grains of rice are sweaty in her palm, and she starts flicking them off one at a time, and Scott yells up the ladder, and then the girls pick out the last of the chaff for the final time before it's ready. And then Inye's voice gets very quiet, and she sounds tired to me. And she takes her hands and she shows me her hands, and they're worn and wrinkled, and she's probably not that old. And she's cradling her hands like this, and she's speaking to me softly in Jola. And I started to understand what she was saying, not because I knew the words, but because now we had this relationship, this human connection. And she was telling me how difficult this work was, but how vital it was to their survival. And she just was going on about this. And then she takes my hand, and she opens my palm, and she grabs another pinch full of rice off the floor, and she puts it to my palm, and she presses down on it gently with her fingers. And she says in French, cadeau, gift. Well, later that day, Scott said, you should really feel honored by what happened back there. He said, that's the equivalent of them showing you the family jewels, and she never would have done that if she didn't think you were going to make a good Jola. Well, a couple weeks later, there was a civil conflict in southern Senegal, and it was bad enough that the State Department decided to pull all of the volunteers out of that region. And I opted to come home instead of being reassigned somewhere else. So I never did learn Jola past those basic greetings. But that day in the rice vault, I learned another language. There's no vocabulary, there's no verb conjugations, there's nothing to memorize, and you don't even have to speak to make yourself understood. And that was the language of kinship. And the only requirement is the recognition of our common humanity. Thank you.